In the year 2124, humanity had risen from the ashes of a devastating war. But peace was fleeting, and the universe, vast and unforgiving, soon revealed its true nature. A dark cloud hung over Earth, not from an unpredictable storm, but from a threat that had been slowly approaching for years. The Draker, a brutal alien empire that had conquered dozens of worlds with their advanced weaponry, relentless tactics, and overwhelming numbers. They had set their sights on Earth. It had started as whispers. Strange signals intercepted by military satellites. Alien ships appearing in the far reaches of the solar system, their purpose unknown. But then it happened. Without warning, the Draker launched a full-scale invasion, leaving Earth's defenses in shambles. The Draker's technology was far superior, and their ruthless determination to subjugate humanity was unparalleled. The Earth's military, though brave, was no match for the overwhelming force that came crashing down on them. Humanity's leaders scrambled to devise a plan to resist, but the Draker were relentless. Cities fell, governments crumbled, and hope seemed to be slipping away. But there was one thing the Draker had underestimated: the spirit of humanity. As the last remnants of Earth's global defenses were obliterated, a ragtag group of survivors began to organize. A coalition of military officers, engineers, scientists, and civilians, driven by a single, burning desire to push back against the invaders, came together. They called themselves the Resistance. It was humanity's final hope, a slim chance to stave off extinction. Among the leaders of the Resistance was Captain Sarah Drake, a decorated officer with the United Earth Forces, now a symbol of defiance. She was no stranger to war. She had fought in countless skirmishes against alien forces over the years. But the Draker were different. Their tactics were calculated, their cruelty boundless. And yet, Drake held on to the belief that humanity could win. Drake's first mission was a desperate one. With the Draker holding Earth's capital city under siege, the Resistance needed to make contact with any surviving military factions still hidden in the wastelands. The last hope was a small but heavily fortified base on the moon, a place where the remnants of Earth's fleet had been gathering in secret. If they could unite and form a counteroffensive, there might still be a chance to turn the tide. Drake led the charge herself, commanding a small crew aboard the Vanguard, a ship that had once been a flagship but was now little more than a rusted hulk. Their journey was perilous, navigating through asteroid fields, Draker patrols, and an atmosphere choked with smoke from the ongoing war. It was a hard fight just to stay alive long enough to reach their destination. But when they arrived at the lunar base, the situation was even worse than expected. The Draker had already breached the outer defenses. The base was under siege, and the few remaining soldiers were making a last stand against an overwhelming force. Sarah's crew fought their way through the shattered defenses, hoping to make it inside the compound and link up with any survivors. The base's commander, Colonel Samuel Jacobs, was a veteran of humanity's last war against the Krelger, a race of reptilian invaders who had nearly destroyed the human race decades before. The Krelger had been relentless, but they lacked the cunning of the Draker. Jacobs was no stranger to impossible odds, and he was ready to fight to the last breath if it meant saving humanity. Captain Drake, Jacobs greeted her as she entered the command center, her boots heavy with the weight of their journey. "I thought we'd be alone here. Didn't think anyone would be foolish enough to come to our aid." "We don't have the luxury of thinking about foolishness anymore, Colonel," Drake said, her voice hard. "We came to give humanity one last chance." Jacobs nodded grimly. "Then we need to move fast. The Draker are closer than you think. We'll need a plan, and we'll need all the firepower we can get if we're going to stop them." Drake's mind raced. There were no more easy solutions. No quick fixes. But if they could take the fight to the Draker's homeworld, there was a slim chance they could cripple their empire from the inside. It would be a suicide mission for most, but humanity had never shied away from impossible odds. "We'll need to assemble every ship we can, gather the last of our forces, and strike at their core. It's the only way," Drake said. "We may not have the numbers or the firepower, but we have something they don't: a will to survive." The Resistance was born anew that day, and for the first time since the invasion began, the hope of victory flickered in the hearts of the survivors. Sarah Drake looked around the command center at the faces of those who had joined her in this impossible fight. It was a ragtag group, a far cry from the unified military forces that had once defended Earth. But in their eyes, she saw the same fire, the same determination that had carried humanity through every trial, every hardship. And in that moment, she knew they would not go down without a fight. The Vanguard shook as it broke through the atmosphere of the moon, its damaged engines struggling to maintain course. Inside, Captain Sarah Drake paced the bridge, her thoughts consumed by the conversation she'd had with Colonel Jacobs. The moon base had fallen, but that was not the worst of it. The Draker were advancing on Earth itself, and without a miracle, humanity would be snuffed out like a dying ember in the cold void of space. "What's the status of the fleet, Lieutenant?" Drake asked, her voice sharp but controlled. Lieutenant Maya Sanchez, a young but skilled navigator, responded quickly, her fingers flying across the console. "We've got 3 ships left in operation, Captain. A handful of smaller vessels, but no heavy artillery or advanced technology. We'll need to rely on sheer numbers and hope for a miracle to even reach the Draker homeworld." Drake clenched her fists. The situation was dire, but she refused to let it show. Not now, not with their last hope on the line. They would make a stand, no matter the odds. "We don't need miracles," she said, her voice unwavering. "We need to think like them. Find their weakness." The Resistance's ragtag fleet limped toward their next destination, a hidden facility buried beneath the surface of Mars, a relic from Earth's pre-war era, designed to house humanity's most advanced weapons, technologies that were thought lost when the war ended in defeat. Drake had heard rumors about it from military engineers who had survived the fall of Earth's defenses. If the stories were true, this forgotten arsenal could provide them with a firepower they desperately needed to challenge the Draker. As the fleet arrived at the Martian outpost, the tension in the air was palpable. The base had been abandoned for decades, its location known only to a select few. As they descended to the surface, the vast red desert stretched out below them, the landscape eerily quiet. The base itself was hidden in a series of craters, its entrances shielded by a series of old security systems. The only way in was through a complex network of tunnels that had been sealed for generations. "Captain, are we sure about this?" asked Lieutenant Sanchez, her voice filled with doubt. "We don't even know if the weapons still work." "We have no choice," Drake replied. "The Draker are too powerful, and if we don't find something to level the playing field, we won't have a chance." The team disembarked from the Vanguard, making their way through the tunnels with weapons drawn. The air was stale, the silence oppressive as they moved deeper into the Martian base. As they reached the heart of the complex, they found what they were looking for, a massive vault door, its surface covered in layers of dust and age. The door was reinforced with technology far beyond anything the Resistance had seen. But there was no time to waste. Drake gave the order to start the power-up sequence, and as the ancient systems hummed to life, the vault door slowly groaned open. Inside, the flickering light revealed rows upon rows of advanced weaponry and tech, sleek, silver ships that seemed to hum with barely contained energy, powerful energy shields, and an array of weapons unlike anything humanity had ever used. "This is it," Sarah said, a sense of awe in her voice. "This is the weapon we need." As the team began to inspect the arsenal, they were startled by a sudden transmission, a high-pitched alarm that echoed through the base's empty halls. The Draker were coming. Somehow, they had tracked the Resistance to Mars. "Get to the ships now," Drake barked. The team rushed to the new fleet of ships, and as they boarded, they saw the faint flicker of the Draker's ships in the distance, a swarm of alien vessels descending toward Mars at terrifying speed. The Vanguard and its allies had no time to lose. "Launch the ships, all of them," Drake ordered, her voice filled with grim determination. In the distance, the first explosions rocked the surface of Mars as the Draker made their move. The Resistance fleet, now bolstered by the new, powerful ships, broke free from the atmosphere, soaring toward the stars. For the first time since the invasion had begun, Sarah Drake felt a glimmer of hope. But there was no time for celebration. The Draker had no mercy, and their overwhelming forces were already closing in. "We may have weapons, but we're still outnumbered," Lieutenant Sanchez warned. "If we're going to take the fight to their homeworld, we'll need more than just firepower." "I know," Drake said, "but we have something they don't. We have the will to fight, to survive. And we'll use it to win." As they set course for the Draker homeworld, the Resistance knew their mission was nothing short of a suicide run. But if humanity was to survive, they had no choice but to confront the Draker head-on. The hidden weapons were just the first step. Now, they had to turn the tide of the war and show the Draker what true resistance looked like. The Resistance fleet surged through the black expanse of space, the engines of their newly acquired ships roaring as they set their course toward the Draker homeworld. Captain Sarah Drake stood at the helm of the Vanguard, watching the stars blur by in the distance. She felt a mixture of determination and dread gnawing at her stomach. This was their final chance, the only way to strike at the heart of the Draker Empire. The newly outfitted ships had given them an edge, but even with their advanced weaponry, they were still vastly outnumbered. The Draker forces were relentless, and their homeworld would be heavily fortified. Drake's mind raced with plans and contingencies. They could not afford failure, not when so many lives were on the line. Lieutenant Sanchez stood at her side, watching the ship's navigation systems with a furrowed brow. "Captain, we're entering Draker space. Their fleet has been tracking us since we left Mars. They know we're coming." "I know," Drake replied, her voice cold. "But they're not expecting us to strike so soon. We'll catch them off guard." Sanchez shook her head. "With all due respect, Captain, how do we plan on outmaneuvering them? Their fleet is 10 times the size of ours. We can't just barge into their homeworld and expect to win." Drake turned toward her, her gaze unwavering. "We won't be barging in. We'll be striking where they least expect it. If we can disable their command ship, we can throw their forces into disarray. Without their leader, they'll be vulnerable." It was a long shot, a gamble, but in war, that's all anyone had, the will to risk it all for a chance at victory. The Resistance fleet split into small, agile groups, their objective clear: infiltrate the Draker's heavily defended outer defense rings, disable their communications, and make a direct assault on the Draker command ship, Vanguard Prime. The mission was simple in theory, but difficult in practice. The Draker had seen their share of rebellion. They would be prepared. The battle would be as much about deception and surprise as it would be about firepower. As the Resistance fleet drew closer to the Draker's outer perimeter, the vast, imposing presence of the Draker ships became impossible to ignore. Massive battleships that resembled floating fortresses, their hulls bristling with weapons and shield generators. They were an intimidating sight, their dark, menacing forms lurking like predators waiting to strike. "Steady," Drake murmured, her hands gripping the controls of the Vanguard. "We go in, we hit fast, and we get out." The first wave of Resistance ships moved ahead, creating a distraction by firing on a smaller Draker ship, luring the enemy forces into a trap. The Draker fleet responded swiftly, converging on the decoy as the main Resistance forces moved deeper into enemy territory. Their plan was working so far. But Sarah knew that the real challenge lay ahead. They had to reach Vanguard Prime without being detected by the vast sensor arrays surrounding the Draker homeworld. "Engage cloaking devices," she ordered. "Keep your distance and stay silent. We can't afford to be detected." The Resistance ships, now invisible to Draker sensors, glided silently through the shadows of space. It was a tense journey, each second stretching longer than the last as the fleet neared the Draker's capital. Sarah's mind was sharp, calculating every move, every counter. They were so close to striking the heart of the enemy. But then, an unexpected message came through the ship's communication system, a signal they couldn't ignore. "Attention, Resistance fleet," a cold voice boomed through the speakers. "This is the Draker High Command. You are foolish to think you can defy us. Surrender now, and we will spare your pitiful species. Resist, and you will be annihilated." It was a taunt, one designed to provoke fear, to shake their resolve. But Sarah Drake was not afraid. The Draker had underestimated humanity before. This time, they would learn just how wrong they were. "We will never surrender," Drake said, her voice steady as she spoke into the comms. "We are humanity, and we will fight until our last breath. Prepare yourselves." The fleet continued its advance, now closing in on the Draker command ship, Vanguard Prime. It was a behemoth of a ship, dwarfing anything humanity had ever built. Its shields were impenetrable, and its weapons were capable of wiping out entire fleets in seconds. But the Resistance had a plan, one that relied on precision and speed. As the fleet approached Vanguard Prime, the Draker launched a counteroffensive, their ships flanking the Resistance from every direction. The battle that ensued was brutal. Explosions rocked the void of space as laser fire and plasma shots filled the air. The Resistance ships weaved and dodged, their smaller, more agile frames providing them with some advantage over the hulking Draker vessels. But it wasn't enough. One by one, Resistance ships were destroyed, their crews fighting valiantly but unable to hold their ground against the Draker onslaught. Sarah's heart sank as she watched their numbers dwindle. The odds were getting slimmer by the second. And yet, the Resistance pressed on, determined to strike at the heart of the enemy. "We're almost there," Sarah muttered to herself. "Just a little longer." They had no choice but to push forward. Failure was not an option. The survival of humanity itself was on the line. And as they neared Vanguard Prime, the final, most dangerous phase of the mission began. The Resistance's path to victory was not clear, but one thing was certain: if they were to win, they would have to do the unthinkable. And even then, it would take more than just firepower to overcome the Draker. It would take everything humanity had left: their courage, their tenacity, and their will to survive. The battle had reached a fever pitch. Explosions echoed through space as Draker and Resistance ships clashed with ruthless intensity. Sarah Drake's eyes never wavered from the view ahead, the massive, foreboding presence of the Draker command ship, Vanguard Prime. It loomed like a great dark mountain in the expanse, its hull bristling with weapons and shield generators. The Resistance fleet had taken heavy casualties, but they were still pressing on, and Sarah knew that the key to victory lay in reaching the heart of the Draker forces, the command ship itself. "Lieutenant Sanchez, how are our engines holding up?" Sarah asked, her voice sharp as a new round of plasma blasts hit the hull of the Vanguard. "Engines are at 70%, Captain," Sanchez replied, her eyes flicking over the console, trying to hold back the desperation creeping into her tone. "We've lost several ships already, and we're getting dangerously close to their defensive perimeter. If we don't get inside their command ship soon, we won't make it out." "We will make it," Sarah said, her voice unyielding. "Prepare the boarding teams. We're taking that ship." The plan was simple, though not without its risks. Sarah and her crew would infiltrate Vanguard Prime with a team of elite soldiers and disable its primary controls, rendering the ship vulnerable to the Resistance's remaining forces. It was a suicide mission for most of them, but the payoff was clear: destroy their command structure, and the Draker would lose the ability to coordinate their fleet. As the Vanguard and its remaining allies drew nearer to the Draker ship, Sarah's heart beat in her chest like a war drum. Time was running out. The Resistance's forces were dwindling, but they had one last shot at this, one final opportunity to turn the tide of the war. The moment arrived. With the Draker ships closing in, the Resistance fighters made their move. They fired their remaining torpedoes, blasting through Vanguard Prime's outer shields and creating a small breach. It was enough. The Vanguard slipped through, narrowly avoiding enemy fire as it headed for the heart of the massive ship. "All teams, prepare for boarding," Sarah ordered. "The moment we breach, we move fast and take control. We're counting on you." The crew nodded in grim silence. The Vanguard shuddered as it entered Vanguard Prime's docking bay. The moment the ship touched down, the doors opened, and the Resistance fighters poured out, guns raised. The Draker defenders, brutal and efficient, were already waiting for them. The battle for the command ship began in a storm of gunfire and blood. Sarah led the charge, her blaster fire precise as she cleared a path through the enemy. The Draker were fierce, but they were not expecting the resistance to board their command ship. It was a battle of raw tenacity, human ingenuity, and sheer willpower against an empire that had crushed every enemy in its path. With every step, the resistance pushed deeper into Vanguard Prime, moving closer to the control center. Along the way, they encountered Draker soldiers at every turn, highly trained, ruthless, and calculating. But they underestimated the humans who fought back with everything they had left. Each resistance soldier was willing to die for the chance to defeat the Draker, and that unrelenting spirit made them formidable opponents. The resistance team encountered a group of Draker officers near the command center. A fierce firefight broke out, the air thick with the sounds of gunfire, and the smell of ozone as lasers and plasma filled the corridors. Sarah's heart pounded as she took cover, trying to pinpoint the enemy's positions. "Captain, we've reached the command center," shouted Lieutenant Sanchez, her voice tense over the comms. "Good work," Sarah said, her tone tight. "Now we take it." The final push was brutal. With every step closer to their objective, the resistance faced more and more Draker resistance. But they refused to give up. They fought tooth and nail, the sound of footsteps echoing through the ship's metallic corridors as the battle intensified. Finally, Sarah reached the control room. The door was reinforced, but nothing the resistance hadn't already dealt with. She took a deep breath, issuing the command for the team to breach. The door exploded with a deafening crack, and Sarah and her squad rushed inside, guns aimed and ready. The control room was a vast, cold chamber, dominated by a massive hollow display at the center, Draker High Command monitoring the entire fleet. And standing before it, a figure clad in dark armor, radiating authority, the Supreme Commander of the Draker Empire. "You're too late," the Supreme Commander said, his voice cold and mocking. "The Draker are invincible. You can't stop us. Even now, my forces are closing in on your homeworld." "We'll see about that," Sarah said, her voice fierce as she raised her blaster and aimed directly at the Supreme Commander. "You're finished." The Supreme Commander let out a low laugh, a sound that made the hairs on the back of Sarah's neck stand up. "You think you've won, Captain Drake? You've only proven one thing: humanity is as foolish as it is brave. But in the end, it will be your undoing." Before Sarah could respond, the commander activated a hidden device in his armor, sending a signal to the Draker fleet. At that moment, the Vanguard Prime shuddered violently, and an alarm began to blare. The ship was on a collision course with Earth, an act of desperation designed to destroy the resistance once and for all. "They're going to crash it into Earth," Sanchez yelled. Sarah's mind raced. There was no time. They had to stop it. She turned to her team. "We've got to disable the ship's core. Now." The countdown had begun. The final battle for humanity had come down to a single, desperate choice: prevent Earth's destruction and eliminate the Draker once and for all, or fail and watch the end of humanity unfold before them. The alarm screamed through the halls of Vanguard Prime as the countdown to collision began. Earth, the last hope for humanity, was mere hours away from being obliterated by the sheer mass of the Draker command ship. Every second felt like an eternity as Sarah Drake and her team rushed toward the core of the ship, their weapons at the ready, their minds focused on the mission at hand. "We can't waste any more time," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the rising pressure. "We need to get to the core and shut down the engines before Vanguard Prime crashes into Earth. Move out." The team sprinted through the corridors, the sound of their boots echoing against the metallic walls. The Supreme Commander's laughter still lingered in Sarah's mind, but she pushed it aside. Now was not the time for doubt. The fate of her homeworld was in her hands, and she couldn't afford to fail. Lieutenant Sanchez led the way, using her technical expertise to guide them through the ship's labyrinthine passages. They encountered more Draker soldiers along the way, vicious and relentless, but the resistance fighters were determined. Each encounter was brutal, with every soldier knowing that this was their final chance to turn the tide of the war. "Hold the line," shouted Sergeant Roberts, leading a small group of soldiers who were providing cover for Sarah's team. "We'll give you the time you need." Sarah gave a sharp nod. "Keep them off us. We're going for the core." As they neared the central engine room, the air grew warmer, the vibrations of the ship's engines thrumming through the walls. The countdown continued, 10 minutes remaining, 9 minutes, 8, each second echoing in Sarah's mind. Suddenly, the doors to the engine room burst open. The team had reached their destination. Inside, rows upon rows of power conduits and energy cells hummed with raw power. The core of Vanguard Prime was a technological marvel, a fusion reactor that had the potential to destroy entire planets if detonated. But there was no time to admire the technology. Sarah's eyes locked onto the central console. The countdown was now at 3 minutes. "We need to override the launch sequence and shut down the reactor," Sarah shouted. "Sanchez, take the lead." Lieutenant Sanchez immediately moved to the control panel, fingers flying over the interface as she accessed the Draker's security systems. The alien technology was unlike anything humanity had ever encountered, complicated, intricate, and fiercely protected by layers of encryption. But Sanchez was a genius when it came to hacking, and she wasted no time in attacking the core's defenses. Meanwhile, Sarah kept her eyes on the door, her pulse pounding as the minutes ticked down. "Hurry, Sanchez," she barked. "We're running out of time." The sound of distant explosions and the clattering of Draker forces approaching the engine room intensified. Sarah's team wasn't alone in here anymore. The Draker were closing in, knowing that the resistance had reached the heart of their ship. "We've got company," shouted Sergeant Roberts, his rifle firing at the approaching Draker soldiers. "Captain, we need to move now." But Sarah's focus never wavered from Sanchez. The fate of the entire mission rested on her ability to hack the Draker's systems and shut down the reactor. Sweat poured down Sanchez's face as she fought against the encrypted codes, her eyes darting back and forth between her console and the rapidly approaching enemy. "Almost there, just a few more seconds," Sanchez muttered, her voice strained. "Got it." Reactor shutdown in progress. The lights inside the engine room flickered as the core's energy began to pulse, the countdown now flashing in red. 30 seconds. But then nothing. The system didn't respond. "I can't stop it," Sanchez gasped, her fingers frantically typing. "It's overriding my commands." "Someone's activated a manual override." "Not good," Sarah said, her heart racing. If the Draker had activated the core's failsafe, there would be no stopping the chain reaction. Earth's destruction was imminent. But then, Sarah had an idea. "Everyone get back," she shouted. "Sanchez, I need you to reroute the core's energy systems into the auxiliary conduits. Use the emergency override and bypass the failsafes." Sanchez's eyes widened. "You're suggesting we rechannel the energy? That's insane. It could destabilize the entire core." "I don't care," Sarah shouted. "We don't have a choice. Earth is counting on us." The seconds were slipping away, and the Draker were closing in on their position. There was no time for a better plan. Sanchez didn't hesitate. She quickly rerouted the power flow, bypassing the failsafe and initiating a dangerous maneuver that could either shut the reactor down completely or cause it to explode. With a final command, the room fell into an eerie silence. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The countdown blinked, and then it stopped altogether. "The reactor is shutting down," Sanchez said, her voice trembling with exhaustion. "It's over. We did it." Sarah exhaled a shaky breath, her hands still gripping her blaster. "Not yet. We need to get out of here." The team turned, but as they moved toward the exit, the sound of Draker soldiers' footsteps grew louder. It wasn't over yet. They still had to escape Vanguard Prime before it exploded. "We need to get to the docking bay," Sarah ordered. "Move, move, move." As they sprinted back through the corridors, explosions erupted around them, shaking the ship to its core. The Draker were not going to let them escape without a fight. With the reactors shut down, the immediate threat of Earth's destruction was over, but Vanguard Prime was on the verge of imploding. The escape would be treacherous, and not all of them might make it. But there was one thing Sarah knew for sure. Humanity had survived the Draker's first attempt to crush them, and they would fight to the end. The corridors of Vanguard Prime were an inferno. The heat from the shutting down reactor had begun to destabilize the ship's systems, and with every passing second, the structure seemed to groan and shudder as if it were on the brink of collapsing. Explosions from the ship's damaged sections filled the air with a deafening roar, and Sarah Drake felt every vibration in the pit of her stomach. The battle was not over yet. They still had one final obstacle: escape. "Keep moving," Sarah shouted, her voice hoarse but determined. "We don't have much time before the whole damn ship falls apart." Her team pressed forward, running through the ever-shrinking corridors of Vanguard Prime, a dangerous mix of fire, debris, and Draker soldiers. The Resistance had already taken heavy losses in their mission, but they weren't about to stop now, not with humanity's future hanging by a thread. Ahead, the docking bay was visible, a sliver of hope in an otherwise hellish landscape. But the closer they got, the more they could hear the Draker reinforcements closing in. The Draker had realized the attack on their ship's core had failed, and now they were bent on preventing the humans from escaping at all costs. "Captain, the path ahead is blocked by debris," Lieutenant Sanchez called over her shoulder, her voice cracking under the strain of their sprint. "We'll have to find another way." Sarah gritted her teeth. They didn't have the luxury of time. "Is there a secondary exit to the bay?" she asked. Sanchez quickly scanned her console, fingers flying across the screen. "There's an emergency hatch 3 levels down. It leads to the outer docking platforms. We can get there, but the odds are slim that the Draker haven't sealed it off already." "Then we break through," Sarah said, her tone resolute. "Lead the way." The team descended through a maintenance shaft, their hands grimy from the oil and heat radiating from the walls. The further they went, the more intense the feeling of danger became. Sarah felt the walls tremble again, a signal that the ship's self-destruct countdown had begun. The seconds were slipping away, and Earth was still vulnerable. By the time they reached the emergency hatch, the sound of Draker soldiers behind them was deafening. The hatch was locked, reinforced, but not indestructible. "Stand back," Sanchez said, drawing a plasma cutter from her pack. She activated it with a hiss, the intense beam slicing through the metal. Sparks flew as she worked, the noise of the cutting tool mingling with the distant cries of battle and the rumbling of the ship's collapse. "We don't have time for this," Sergeant Roberts snapped, peering back at the approaching Draker. "They're almost on us." "Almost there," Sanchez grunted, her hands shaking but her focus unshaken. Finally, with a screech of metal, the hatch gave way. A blast of cold air met them, and they were on the docking platforms, exposed to the vast, star-strewn expanse of space. The Resistance had only one chance now: to get to the escape pods, launch, and escape the destruction of Vanguard Prime. But as they sprinted toward the nearest pod, the sound of Draker soldiers' footsteps was replaced by a new, terrifying sound, one that made Sarah's heart stop, the booming echo of a Draker battleship's engines coming to life. "No," Sarah shouted, her pulse quickening. "They're launching their fleet. They won't let us leave." Without warning, a Draker vessel, sleek and terrifying, flew past overhead, its engines roaring as it opened fire on the platform. The explosion from a near miss sent shockwaves through the docking area, throwing Sarah and her team to the ground. "Get to the pods, now," Sarah ordered, dragging herself to her feet. They couldn't stop them all, but they had to get out. They reached the nearest pod. The hatch was already opening, but the air was thick with smoke and debris. Draker soldiers appeared at the end of the platform, charging toward them with blasters aimed and ready to fire. "Go." Sarah pushed Sanchez into the pod. "Get it started." As the team scrambled to climb aboard, the first wave of Draker fire struck, blasting pieces of the platform apart. The sound was deafening, and Sarah's ears rang. She sprinted, making it to the pod just in time, the doors closing behind her with a hiss. The pod shot into space, the Vanguard Prime looming behind them, a dying behemoth. The massive ship began to disintegrate, its outer layers rupturing as the reactor core began its final meltdown. A wave of energy shot from the ship, propelling the pod faster, as Sarah watched the glowing fireball of destruction engulf the Draker ship. They had done it. They had escaped. For a moment, silence filled the pod. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. Then, Sarah's voice broke the stillness. "We made it. Earth is safe." But as she looked at the stars ahead, she knew the war wasn't over. The Draker might have lost their flagship, but they were far from defeated. And humanity's last stand was far from finished. "Prepare for battle, everyone," Sarah said, her gaze steely as she looked toward the horizon of space. This is just the beginning. Months had passed since the fall of Vanguard Prime, and while the dust had settled over Earth, the scars of war were still fresh. The human spirit, though battered, was far from broken. The Draker Empire had been dealt a severe blow, but they had not been fully defeated. The fight was not over, and the battle for humanity's future was far from finished. Sarah Drake stood before a large, panoramic window in the newly constructed headquarters of the United Earth Coalition. The sun was setting over the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the planet. For the first time in years, the skies seemed clearer, almost hopeful. The scars from the invasion had begun to heal, but Sarah knew that peace was fragile. As Sarah gazed at the beautiful view, she couldn't help but think of the many lives lost in the fight. The resistance had paid a steep price, and many had not made it out alive. The Vanguard had been lost in the final battle, as had countless ships and soldiers who fought with everything they had to ensure Earth's survival. But humanity had prevailed. For now. Captain Drake, a voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see Lieutenant Sanchez, standing with several other officers, their faces worn but determined. "The Coalition is requesting your presence. They need to discuss the next phase of our defense strategy." Sarah nodded, though she felt the weight of the moment. The time for mourning was over, and now it was time to rebuild, both Earth and their forces. "Tell them I'll be there shortly," Sarah replied. She gave them a reassuring smile, though she felt the burden of their situation still heavy on her shoulders. "We have a lot of work to do." As the officers filed out, Sarah turned back to the window. The war wasn't truly over. The Draker Empire was still out there, and they would return. The Vanguard Prime may have been destroyed, but the Draker fleet had scattered, and they would reorganize. Sarah had no illusions about the future. The price of freedom would continue to be steep. But she also knew something that had been proven through the war. Humanity was capable of incredible resilience. They had fought an impossible battle, and they had won. The Draker Empire had underestimated humanity's resolve, and that had been their fatal mistake. The Earth was not ready to surrender. It had just begun to fight back. Sarah's gaze shifted, and she saw a small, flickering light on the horizon, a signal of hope. She clenched her fist, feeling a spark of determination rise within her. "Prepare for battle," she whispered, her voice steady. "We'll be ready. And this time, we'll finish what we started." As the last rays of sunlight faded behind the horizon, Sarah Drake knew that humanity's true test was still to come. But one thing was certain: Earth would never back down. The dawn of the resistance had arrived.